soy Vanessa Falcón Horta, transfronteriza de la región San Diego-Tijuana. I'm also a scholar and organizer focusing my work on the social justice of transfronterizo students and your co-host for this podcast. Joining us today is Dr. Oscar Martínez, who is a Regent Professor of History at the University of Arizona, founder and former president of the Association of Borderland Studies, and founder of the Journal of Borderland Studies. Dr. Martínez has authored and edited several books, articles, and book chapters. Among those are Border People, Life, and Society in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, just to name a few. Dr. Martínez, thank you so much for joining us today and supporting us in understanding the complexities of the U.S.-Mexico borderland and its history. So my first question to you is, how was life growing up, and what inspired you to study life in the borderlands?
Well, I was inspired by experiences that I had when I was growing up in Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. I thought it was very interesting crossing the border almost every day, especially during the school year. We lived in Juarez when I was of grammar school age. So my mother enrolled my older brother and I in school in El Paso, in a Catholic school. And I went there for 6 years. The first two, we went to school in Ciudad Juarez. So just the experience of going from one city to the other, riding the streetcar from Juarez to El Paso, and having the experience of going to a US school after having gone to a Mexican school. And it was just very natural to have a bilingual, bicultural experience from the very beginning. So just in retrospect, when I was in college, that's the time that I started to reflect on that experience, plus others, living on the border most of my life. And so that encouraged me to major in Latin American studies, studying Mexico and other parts of Latin America, the relationships of that region with the United States, and especially along the US-Mexico border. And over the years, as I have done research, I have gone back and thought about those kinds of experiences growing up, and later on as an academic, because I've spent my professional life, most of it along the US-Mexico border, teaching at the University of Texas at El Paso, and also at the University of Arizona.
Thank you for sharing. So how has the border changed since its inception up until today? What are the differences? What are the changes you have seen?
Well, the border itself, the demarcation line hasn't changed much, but it has changed a little. There have been adjustments in the border line as a result of shifts in the Rio Grande River and the Chamizal, which is a tract of land in the El Paso, Ciudad Juarez area. That was in dispute for a long time. And when it was finally resolved in the 1960s, then a part of El Paso wound up in Mexico. But in other parts of the border, there have been small tracts of land that have gone from the US to Mexico and then from Mexico to the US. And there have been exchanges of those small tracts of land that have altered the course of the Rio Grande. But it's not really such a big deal. The big changes have come about as a result of economic growth and development in the US Southwest and along the border. And the same thing on the Mexican side, which has generated population growth from one end of the border to the other. giving rise to all these twin city complexes that have evolved from Tijuana, San Diego to Brownsville, Matamoros, and quite a few twin city complexes in between. And that's what has generated significant changes, because as time has gone by, both governments have come up with policies to regulate the flow of people back and forth, and then also to regulate the flow of trade back and forth. But one of the biggest changes, and I think this is important for us at the present time, that one of the biggest changes has come as a result of things that have happened on the border. For example, the rise of drug trafficking as a major problem. This has created tension between Mexico and the United States, and has driven the US to come up with policies that certain times in the history of the border, there has been conflict and shutting down the border as a result of that problem of drug trafficking. And then we have 9/11, that the attack on the United States on September 11th, 2001, that led to increased militarization of the border, which had already been in progress since the 1980s as a result of the conflict, not only regarding drug trafficking, but also conflicts arising from undocumented migration. That led the US to develop these policies of militarizing the border more and more. So after 9/11, the US then took some drastic actions that it had not taken before to make it much harder for people to cross the border from Mexico to the United States. No problem for Americans going from the US to Mexico, but people coming from Mexico to the US, because there was a lot of suspicion that terrorists from the Middle East in particular would enter Mexico and then come to the border and sneak across into the US and do harm to this country. So therefore, you have a big increase in the Border Patrol. You have harsher laws, immigration laws. You have a great expansion of the law enforcement on the border. And for people who live on the border, for transnational people like yourself and me living on the border, it's just made it much harder to go back and forth because the lines got longer, the waiting periods got longer to cross into the US. And as the years went by, now we're talking about the 21st century after 9/11, the drug trafficking problem also got worse in Mexico, especially in the years 2008, 2009, 2010. The violence was extreme in Mexico because they declared a war on drugs over there. And Ciudad Juarez was at the center of the war on drugs. Tijuana was also one of the major cities affected by this, and other border cities. So that then drove the US government to do even more, to increase the law enforcement, to increase the fencing and the building of walls from one end of the border to the other. Well, in the urban areas primarily, not the whole border, but in the urban areas. And so these are the big things that have happened, that have shaped the way that the economies and the societies that live along the border have interacted with each other. And then most recently, you have all these caravans coming in from Central America, and that has caused a lot of friction and harsher laws, harsher immigration laws during the Trump administration. And then most recently, we have the problem of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And that has shut down the flow of traffic, except for uh, Americans who can go into Mexico if they have a valid reason for doing so, and Mexicans coming to the US. But the traffic is highly regulated. And so we live in a very different situation, Vanessa, than, than what existed along the border, let's say before the 1990s, and years that I can remember when it was so much easier to cross the border and to enjoy the benefits of living on the border, going into Ciudad Juarez, for example, eating in Mexican restaurants and going to Mexican movies, enjoying visits with friends and families frequently, and not having to worry about crossing the border because it would only take half an hour up to 45 minutes that I remember. And that was it. So unfortunately, we find ourselves in this situation now.
Thank you. And looking back at history and just the documentation of the border throughout time, have you ever encountered or seen any documentations or studies on students crossing the border?
I'm sure there are studies out there, academic studies. Um, I haven't run across studies except for references to educational institutions along the border, references and articles and books. But since that hasn't been an area of research for me, I haven't looked for these studies, but I'm sure that there are. And I mentioned my colleague, Dr. Bixler Marquez, who would know about the academic studies. He himself wrote a dissertation, and out of the dissertation, he has publications. So that would be a good question to ask him. But I can tell you that that people along the border from the very beginning, when the boundary was established in 1848, and the towns that were then thriving on the border, and as population growth took place, uh, students started going back and forth, mainly from Mexico to the US. So that goes back to the 1850s in the lower Rio Grande Valley. Here in Ciudad Juarez, it goes back to the 1880s because El Paso was nothing but a very small settlement on the north bank of the Rio Grande. And the big town was on the other side of the river, Paso del Norte, which became Ciudad Juarez. And so when El Paso began growing after the railroads arrived here in the early 1880s, well, schools were set up in El Paso, and Mexican students began coming to school in the U.S. And many decades later, I was a student like that, following that tradition.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that is very insightful and just kind of refreshing overall, seeing that that was also your experience. To see others who have had similar backgrounds and now are very successful scholars, professors. It really goes a long way. Now, coming back to today and the important elements that you mentioned about the borderlands, such as the militarization, the border enforcing policies, and even the pandemic, what do you envision for the future of the border and the interactions of borderlanders in light of the current circumstances?
Well, it's kind of tricky. As an optimist, I want to think that when the pandemic ends, we will get back to normal, and the um, going back across the border will not be as hard as it is today. But I am concerned about the migration coming from Central America in particular, but also parts of Mexico. They're going to be affected by climate change. And that is going to continue, and that is going to be a big challenge for the Mexican government. It's going to be a big challenge for the US government, and it's going to have the impact that you would expect on the border, because I'm sure that the US government, even when you have a more sympathetic government like we have now with a Joe Biden administration that has more compassionate views of migration from Latin America to the United States. Nonetheless, I can't imagine that the border would become open, and it would be easy for these migrants to come to the United States and to find asylum, or to be given permits to come for periods of time to work and then return. But maybe at least the US, I would think, would come up with a program that would resemble the Bracero program that functioned from 1942 or so until 1964, where Mexicans would come to work and in the fields, and the railroads, and in other industries under contract. And at the end of their contract, they would return to Mexico. And then the following year, they would come back, and they really contributed significantly to the economy of the United States. So the US might come up with that kind of a program, but we'll see. We'll see. There's a lot of opposition to the Bracero program when it existed. A lot of opposition from Hispanic groups who felt that Mexican workers were being exploited. A lot of opposition from labor groups claiming, and they were right, that these workers were paid lesser wages, and the working conditions are not good, and that harmed US workers. So this is a complex issue. This interaction between Mexico and the United States is a complex issue. And hopefully it won't be complicated by any more terrorist types attacks that we might encounter in the future.
Yes, absolutely. So we have Julio here, has a question. Julio, join us.
You don't mind. So yes, so I had to shut down my camera because it's sucking up some bandwidth. So it's in order to sound a little bit clearer. Yeah, so it seems that at its inception, the commuting across the border, or just going through across the border, has always been very fluid in it, or giving the nature of how people move from one land to another or migrate. And so as with the unfolding of history and the events, it seems like the emboldening of the separation between the two nations has taken place. And so is there a possibility to maybe see the reality as the people who migrate, and what would it take politically, I guess, for, I guess, in an attitude sense or policy wise, to understand that reality?
Well, you know, a lot of people in the US just don't understand that reality. There is so much ignorance about the border, about Mexico, how the border came to be, a lot of ignorance about Mexico's role in the development of the United States. Half of Mexico was taken by the United States as a result of the US-Mexico War. That was an aggressive war on the part of the US military conquest that forced Mexico to give up half of its territory, the better half, the half that had the most potential for economic development. That is a very important point in getting people to understand how Mexico has been present in the Southwest, um, and has a much longer presence in this area all along the border than the United States. So there's a huge challenge educating people, and that's the beginning point for educating people. But unfortunately, I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen. So we only have a small percentage of the population that really understands not only that, the presence of Mexico in the Southwest and Spain before Mexico in the Southwest. Not only that, but there's a great deal of ignorance about the role that Mexico plays economically in the United States now as a result of the tremendous interdependence that exists between the two countries, and that it is in the best interest of the US to maintain good relations with Mexico, and also good relations with the people who live on the border, on both sides of the border, because the US government often comes up with policies that are detrimental to both sides of the border. Um, and unfortunately, we have a huge percentage of the population, the conservative sector of the US population, that is so focused on migration, and their feeling is, migration from the third world, migration from Latin America into the United States needs to be stopped at all costs. And then there's a problem of racism, because these are mostly dark-skinned people with a different language, a different culture, a different religion. And so racism then plays a big role in that issue as well. And even if we have a more understanding government like we have now, so different from the views that we saw in the actions and policies of the Trump administrations. Now we have something different. But even there, the Biden administration is going to be very cautious on how it deals with the migration problem, and very cautious about its border policies. So that's unfortunately where we are, and climate change is getting worse. And so the problem of migration is, I think, going to grow. And the problem of drug trafficking is not going away either. And that's a huge issue. Those two issues combined have created a volatile environment on the border for a long time. And those challenges are going to continue.
Thank you. If you could give a piece of advice to policymakers or leaders along the borderlands to foster the development of the region and to foster the success of the region, what would you tell them?
Well, we have some people, these leaders who live on the border. It's been my experience, and I've lived on the border most of my life and have studied these issues. They have a pretty good understanding of the relationship between the two countries, the positive role that Mexico plays in the economy, the need to have amiable relations with the Mexican side of the border, the same thing on the Mexican side of the border. And so I don't really need to give them any advice, because they're very knowledgeable and most of the leaders are um, very well prepared to deal with these issues. The problem is, and always has been, that the central government in Washington has its own skewed view of the border and its role in the nation as a whole. And that's not only true for the US, it's also true for the Mexican side. Mexico City has a different view of what needs to be done on the border. And so it's a constant struggle on both sides to deal with the central governments and to persuade them that um, they need to have, the central governments need to have policies that are not detrimental to the border area. And they need to get away, especially the US government needs to get away from the view that the border represents a threat to the sovereignty of the country or to the welfare of the country. But one of the complications here is that there are many conservative politicians who get benefit from portraying the border as a dangerous place, as a place that threatens the sovereignty of the US and is a place that needs to be militarized in order to deal with those perceived threats. And that's a big challenge. And as a historian, I have looked at these issues historically, and that's been going on for generations and will continue to go on.
So it seems like attitudes need to change all the way from central governments on both sides.
Well, they do, but it's hard to change attitudes. It takes education, and how do you reach? How do you reach these people who have never lived on the border, and who see the border as simply a political line, and that's where the country ends, and the border needs to be guarded, and the people across the border need to be watched carefully, and those people represent threats to the United States. You know, it's just very hard to get away from that. And the reality is that we do have these two major problems that have been going on for a long time. The issue of undocumented migration and the issue of drug trafficking. So that makes it even harder to be able to convince people that the border is not the kind of threat that they see, but rather is a positive, a place that plays many positive roles in the welfare of the United States and also in the welfare of Mexico.
Yes, absolutely. We're getting close to the end of our interview, and I have a couple questions to conclude. But before we transition on to those questions, were there any topics that you wanted to address that maybe you didn't get a chance to address?
No, I think we talked about the big issues. Um, so no, but I'd be happy to answer any other question that you might have.
Thank you. And Julio, if you are there, do
Yeah,
you have
Julio.
any questions?
Yes, I was wondering. Something that I faced. I'm sure Vanessa faced was as we were commuting across the border. I came across with definitely nativist sentiments from within their own Latino community, since they see us moving back and forth seamlessly. I mean, to a certain extent, in their perception, and so it seems like you had to win over sometimes people from your community, and because they adopted a mainly more conservative views of how the border, like you mentioned, should be guarded. How do we, I guess, win them over again to see them? And have you come across that as well? Did you come across that?
Oh, sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. Here in El Paso, we have a segment of the Hispanic community that has these kinds of views that resembles the nationalist views that you find in other parts of the United States. Um, and it's very sad. It's very sad to see a Latino, Latina, Mexican American um, calling for greater enforcement on the border and go back to Mexico where you came from and all those things. I just see these people as having fallen into the trap that many Americans throughout the country have fallen into regarding their views about Mexico, seeing Mexico in a very negative light. You've heard people talk about how corrupt Mexico is, and their leaders are no good, and their government is no good. Those are all exaggerations and reflect deep biases and stereotypes about Mexico. And the same thing about immigrants. And how do you deal with our own people who have these kinds of attitudes? Well, if I could, I would just drag them into courses like the history of the US Mexico borderlands, drag them into the history of Mexican Americans and history of Mexico, and let's get down to the facts, um, and find out what the real history has been, and look at the real evidence, and not listen to people who I think are victimized by the media, like Fox News, for example, um, and other media outlets, and these nationalists, white extremists that we have in the U.S. that push these views. Well, the Trump administration pushed these kinds of views and these kinds of attitudes, and the only way you can fight it is through education. But once people get out of school and they're not learning anymore, well, it's up to them where they're going to get their information. And unfortunately, there are sources of information that are spewing propaganda instead of giving us the truth based on evidence.
Absolutely. And that's one of our hopes for the work that we're doing, and this podcast in particular as well, to have the realities, the real life stories of Borderlanders and the diversity of it, particularly here, us sharing our story. But we're almost just about the tail end of our meeting. Julio, any other questions that maybe you had, burning questions before we end?
No, I think good. I think it's just we had a retelling of the border in a brief manner, which is we're looking for. Um, no, just I think I have my questions answered. I don't know if Dr. Martinez is curious about anything that we are doing.
Well, you had asked about what I would advise students who want to study the border.
Yes.
To be patient right now. Be patient because it's hard. It's hard to do research. Even in the U.S., here in El Paso, the libraries are closed. I can't go down to the archives like I want to. And so if you're doing a doctoral dissertation and you need to go to the archives or any place else that has the information, these places are closed. So we have to be patient. Then if you're doing research across the border in Mexico, well, not only are they closed, but it's harder to do the work in Mexico right now. So If I were a student doing a dissertation along the border, I'd find a way to emphasize the US side and find a way to utilize materials, sources of information that are readily available, because it's too hard to, to search those collections, those archives that are not available right now.
Thank you. That advice really goes a long way. I think for many of our listeners who, live this experience and beyond living it are definitely doing the work and also scholarship. So, and also I personally appreciate it as well, because that's where I'm at the moment. So I just overall am elated for this opportunity. So happy and grateful for your time. Your work has definitely had an impact on the understanding of the US-Mexico borderlands profoundly. It's foundational pieces of for anybody who is trying to understand or write about US-Mexico border. We definitely have to start with the history, and your work really just provides an extensive understanding of that. So I just appreciate your work, and also I appreciate the advice. So this is the end of our interview, but before we conclude, are there any last comments or words that you would like to say before we end?
Well, I just want to say that it's been a pleasure to meet you and Julio. And I'm so impressed with the work that you're doing. It's really a positive thing to do this. And so thank you for including me.